Hi, fantasy readers. This is Karyne Norton, your fellow book binger, and you are listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, where you can test out a new fantasy story every single week to find your next favorite author. Last week, you heard the first half of Shattered Threads, and this week, you'll get to hear the end of it. So if you haven't heard the first part yet, be sure to go back and listen. This story is rich with magic, family ties, and forlorn dragons, so you can't jump in at the halfway mark. It's written by A.L. Lorensen, who I had the pleasure of meeting in person last year at FanX in Salt Lake City. I think it's a yearly thing for her, so if you're headed that way in September, you'll have to hunt her down. Stick around to the end or check out today's show notes to see where you can find more from Ashley. I also have a quick 2-question survey about the future of the podcast that I'd love for you all to chime in on, which I'll explain after the story. In the meantime, please enjoy Shattered Threads, Part 2, by A.L. Lorensen. Val didn't sleep. Kalya kept her silent, unmoving watch until late into the night. Eventually, her body seemed to give out. She crumpled where she stood and started lightly snoring. Val stayed in her bedroll for another hour, watching Kalya and trying to figure out what to do. Crickets whirred in the trees, and fireflies bobbed along the trail of magic to see where it seemed to disappear. That was where the cave had to be, the last stretch before reaching the dragon. Val couldn't take Kalya up there. Whatever plans the girl had for the dragon could only be nefarious. And if that plan somehow managed to bring back the dead, it would spell doom for the rest of Lorelyn. But Val wasn't powerful enough to stop her. That had been made abundantly clear. She needed a way out of this mess. Fast. As Val's thoughts tumbled in non-constructive circles, growing grimmer with each moment, a song brushed her ears. Every thought stopped as her body clenched. She peeked at Kalya, but the girl was still snoring away, the feather cradled close to her like a doll. The song wasn't from her. Val strained to hear the music. Was it one person? A group of people? Soldiers had been wandering in small units since the Elanwen Queen's death, searching for remnants of the winged people and driving them out of Lorelyn. If a group of soldiers was camped on the mountainside, they might be able to help. As Val listened, she saw faint traces of gold wend their way through the trees, curling and bobbing in time with the music. Magic. Val hesitated for a moment. Approaching unknown sorcerers was an easy way to wind up seriously injured, or worse. Val glanced at Kalya again, who looked peaceful but otherworldly in the mottled moonlight. She'd rather chance her luck on an unknown devil than the one she had here. Val eased her way out of her bedroll, grimacing at her rustling blankets and watching Kalya for any signs of movement. Val slipped her boots on, heart pounding in her mouth. She refused to think about what would happen if Kalya caught her. She had made her choice, and she would live with the consequences. Chills still ran down her spine as she snuck away. No matter how much her mind screamed at her to run, Val clenched her teeth and continued forward cautiously. She would not be a slave to fear. A mad dash through the trees would make too much noise and leave an obvious trail behind her. She would keep her head. She had to, no matter what her trembling limbs said otherwise. It surprised Val how long it took her to follow the magic to its source. Sound shouldn't have carried as far as it had, unless it was inexplicably tied to the magic, or was purposefully being projected. Val didn't like the feeling of being lured into a trap, but she had no other choice. She touched her mother's bracelet for good luck, the dragon scale cool and smooth beneath her fingers, and pressed on. Eventually, firelight came into view, warm and soft against the cold shadows of the trees. A woman's voice carried to Val, accompanied by plucked lute chords. The sound of the woman's song was rich and inviting, a soothing balm to the fear Val had been stifling. Val still approached with caution, unwilling to put her life in someone else's hands again. Kalya's wretched, growling voice still haunted her. Keeping to the shadows and moving only when necessary, just as she had done while hunting game throughout her childhood, Val maneuvered herself into a vantage point. From behind a white oak, she peered out at the singing woman. The woman had tucked herself against a large, mossy rock, staring into the stars as she sang and twanged the lute in her lap. Her stockinged feet rested near her fire, which leapt and danced merrily in time with her song. The shadows it cast trailed across the woman like puppets, highlighting a large, jagged scar that crossed the bridge of her nose and both eyelids. Other than that single scar, there wasn't anything of note about the woman. She was young and of average build, someone that Val could have passed 1,000 times in a crowd and never noticed. The woman ended her song and smiled at her lute, turning one of the pegs at the end of its neck to adjust a string until she was satisfied. "Should we play something our guest will know?" she asked it. Val froze, dread clawing up her throat. The woman didn't wait for a response from her lute, but began to strum a soft, crooning song. "Hush now, my child, my young meadowlark. Do not fear the dark. Your mother is watching. My darling, my dear, and all will be well till you wake." If an arrow had struck Val in the heart at that moment, it would have hurt less. Tears sprang to her eyes. In this, the place her mother had visited so often and died in, her mother's lullaby resonated deep within her bones and tore through her heart. Before she could stop herself, she stepped into the firelight, all caution and logic dismissed. No one could mean her harm when they sang those words. The woman smiled at her, but kept singing. She motioned with her head for Val to sit next to her by the fire. Val did so without question, her cheeks wet. She joined in the song, her voice thick and tremulous. "For I am the night, and I am the stars, that guard you, my baby, where'er you are. So sleep now in peace, let all worries cease, for your mother shall ever stay near." Every word was like a stitch over a wound Val didn't realize she had left open. They ached, but there was healing in them too. The gold-tinged music swirled past Val, twisting through the forest and awaking a deep blue glow. Kana's glow. "I love you, Val," her mother's voice whispered. Val covered her mouth as a sob hitched in her chest, more tears streaking down her cheeks. She never thought she would hear that voice again. "I made a choice to protect my friend," her mother said. "My choices are not your burden to bear. I love you so, so much." Val closed her eyes and let the words sweep over her. With every breath, she felt her mother's arms wrap around her, felt her heartbeat beside her own, and the fizz Kana's magic always carried with it when she was near. Val didn't feel tethered to the earth anymore. Instead, she was enveloped, wholly and completely, in her mother's love, free and light and complete. The song ended, and the weightlessness faded, but the overflow of emotions remained in Val's chest, warm and comforting. She took a breath as if it were her first, the air clear and bracing and alive. When Val opened her eyes, the other woman was watching her with a softness that could have been an embrace. Val felt no shame for the tears that lingered on her cheeks. "Who are you?" The woman smiled. "Just a bard." Val got the impression that was the only information she would get on the matter. The bard leaned forward. Your mother helped me write that song years ago. Her smile fell, taking in Val's tears. How long ago did you lose her? A few years, Val said, amazed at how easy it was to talk with this woman, whose eyes seemed as old as the mountains themselves. Did you know her well? Enough to know that she was never to be crossed, and that you were her whole world. She smiled sadly at Val. We crossed paths frequently on our way to see an old friend. She motioned to the top of the mountain. Val shook her head. Seems everyone but me made that trek. The bard chuckled. Your mother made the treks. I try, but always stop before reaching the top. She tightened her grip around the lute, the strings plinking sadly. She didn't elaborate any further. Her eyes glossed over for a moment, but then she blinked, and they came back into focus. Are you here to take up your mother's self-appointed mantle? A knot twisted itself in Val's gut, growing with a feeling as dark and hollow as Kalya's presence. No, she said. She glanced up the mountain. Her mother's magic burned bright in the dark. She didn't know how many times her mother had walked up and down that mountain path. But she knew one thing. It was time the dragon made its own path. She knew what she had to do. It was the only way. Val turned to the bard. Thank you for the song. I don't know what kind of magic you put into it, but it was what I needed. She stood and faced the mountain. She had an hour, 2 at most, before the sky would start to lighten and wake Kalya. She had to work fast. The bard stood with her, following her gaze up the mountain. Do you need help? She asked Val. There was an odd sort of weight to the question. It was more than just a token gesture. It rang with the idea that help could be many things. Val shook her head. Thank you, but no, this is my lot to finish. The bard frowned, but nodded. Val left her and trekked the rest of the way up the mountain, guided by the light of her mother's magic. The end of the trail was exactly as Val had anticipated it to be. A tumble of rocks, large, foreboding, and seemingly impenetrable. But when she followed her mother's magic around one particular angle, a cavern entrance appeared between 2 sheer walls. Taking a bracing breath, she made her way inside. The cavern was deep, but shafts of natural light seeped in through cracks in the cavern walls, lighting her path. Daylight was already breaking. She didn't know how much time she would have before Kalya made her way up the mountain. As Val drew deeper into the caves, blasts of warm air swept past her in regular bursts, carrying with them the smell of sulfur and dust. It wasn't until the sun crested over the mountain and flooded through a natural skylight that she realized the gusts were not rumblings from the depths of the earth, but the deep breaths of a sleeping dragon. Its form was massive, filling nearly the entire cavern like a cat curled up in a crate. Its black hide shimmered like iridescent obsidian in the light, rising and falling like the tide with every breath. Its head was as long as Val was tall, with horns curving elegantly away from the crown, and rested on its large wicked talons. Nestled close to the dragon's ribs were the skeletal remains of a smaller dragon, and within that was a nest of 5 large eggs, each glowing as the light touched them. A thick, broken thread wafted forlornly between the dragon and the skeleton, but blinding threads wrapped around each of the eggs from its heart. Magic swirled within the eggs in a riot of colors, and Val let out a gasp before she could stop herself. Sweet Sister Earth, they were still alive. The black dragon stirred, flexing its talons and raking deep furrows in the dirt. Is that you, Kana? His voice rumbled in Val's mind, deep and gravelly. He opened one silver eye, milky with age.
"I've been wondering what I've done to offend you."
Thundering sounds came from the dragon's throat in short, quick bursts, and with a start, Val realized the dragon was laughing. Hello, she choked out past the dryness in her mouth. I'm sorry, but I'm not Kana. She died. The dragon's laughter stilled.
"Dead?"
A mournful sound tumbled from his jaws.
"Death is cruel. To make me watch so many loved ones come and go, and leave me behind in this world. I am so lonely. But still, he will not claim me."
The dragon keened, his tail lashing fretfully against the cavern walls. Rubble rained down, and the skylight grew larger as its edges crumbled. Val threw her hands over her head to shield herself. The bracelet flashed in a light. The dragon's writhing stopped. He gazed, transfixed, at the bracelet. He swung his head slowly toward Val, sniffing deeply.
"You carry the mark of my friend,"
he said, as he peered at the bracelet.
"And you smell of Kana. Are you the Valeshta I have heard so much about?"
Val gaped at the dragon. Ma spoke of me? To you? More laughter from the dragon.
"You stand in the presence of the last of the great dragons, and that is your question?"
The dragon settled low, his head resting on the ground so his eyes could be level with hers.
"Yes, Valeshta. I know many things about you. You were your mother's treasure, and she doted over you as fiercely as any dragon over its hoard."
He stretched one of his dark wings over his clutch of eggs, drawing them protectively closer.
"I am Shastrith," he said. "Stories of you kept me company through what otherwise would have been many dark, lonely years. It is an honor to finally meet you."
Val wanted to speak of her mother, ask what stories she told, and hear his stories of Kana. But she knew what was making its way up the mountain. Shastrith, I would stay here for days on end to hear stories about my mother, but someone is coming for you. I don't know what their intentions are, but I know they're not good. She placed her hand on his snout, his scales warm and smooth beneath her palm. You have to leave. Shastrith reared his head back, almost panicked.
"I cannot,"
he said, his tail curling tightly around the skeletal dragon.
"My treasures are here. I cannot leave my mate and clutch."
Val looked at the dragon remains, her heart breaking. That's your mate? A small whimper sounded from Shastrith. Val was reminded of her mother's bed at home, untouched, a physical shrine to everything she had lost. Shastrith, She swallowed the lump in her throat. You can't sit in the dark forever. You have spent your time mourning. I know the loss will never truly be gone, but wouldn't your mate want you to be safe? To be happy?
"My mate and I wanted many things,"
Shastrith said bitterly.
"But we don't always get what we want."
Shastrith, please. You are my mother's dearest friend. Please, let me help you. We'll take the eggs somewhere safe, and nowhere is safe for you anymore. Val was blown back into the cavern wall, smashing her shoulder. She tried to draw herself back up, but she couldn't breathe. Air currents swirled around her, sucking the oxygen away from her lungs. She gasped and clawed at her throat, but couldn't draw breath. You sorcerers dare lie to me again? Through hazy vision, Val saw Kalya's tiny form. I warned you, Valeshta, the girl cried, her soft voice shrill and dark. "I told you what would happen, and unlike you, I keep my promises." Val's soul felt detached from her body, swirling high over her head as she watched herself die. Shastrith roared and flung his tail at Kalya. Kalya stopped him from flattening her with a burst of magic, but that distracted her away from Val. The winds died, and Val could breathe again. "I am not your enemy," Kalya shouted at Shastrith. "I'm here to make a deal."
"We do not make deals with those that hurt our kin."
Shastrith seethed, his tail lashing across the cavern and his wings bristling. Kin, Val thought, her heart blooming with warmth. "What if someone you viewed as kin betrayed you?" Shastrith's tail stilled. Smoke billowed from his nose, but his eyes had fixed solely on Kalya.
"What is it you seek from the last of the dragons?"
he asked, a low growl forcing its way from his chest. Val picked herself up, her body screaming, and inched her way out of Kalya's eyesight toward the dragon eggs. "Shastrith, you can't listen to this girl," she hissed. "She's not right in the head." But Shastrith either didn't hear her or decided to ignore her. Before Val could get completely out of view, Kalya turned her gaze back on her. She spat something in a language Val didn't understand, and Val's body seized up, not hurt, but unable to move. Val's eyes widened, and dread seeped down her spine. Kalya's grin returned, devoid of everything except pure, horrifying satisfaction. "I seek what is mine," she said to Shastrith. "I seek what was taken." Even with the inhuman look on Kalya's face, Val recognized the very human emotion in her voice. Loss. Grief. The sound of someone whose loved one had been ripped from them too soon. Val knew that voice well. It seemed Shastrith did as well. A great shudder ran the length of his body.
"What you wish for I cannot give,"
he said.
"One cannot steal what is death's."
His tail twined with the skeletal tail beside him. Kalya drew herself to her full height, her chin tilted regally. "I aim to rectify the Phoenix's mistake," she said with full confidence. "Your power will be my first great step toward that goal." A sneer spread across her face. "Laws written by imperfect gods must wallow in imperfection by nature." Shastrith considered her for a long moment. Val's heart pounded in her throat as she silently begged the dragon to banish the girl from the cave. But he didn't. Instead, he considered her, his silver eyes gleaming in the stray beams of light.
"What will I receive in exchange for my power?"
Val's stomach dropped. No, no. "Shastrith, don't listen to her," she hissed again. Kalya drew her feather from her belt, stroking it carefully. "New life," she said.
"I have lived too many,"
Shastrith replied wearily. Kalya's smile faltered slightly. "Dominion over all man, then." Shastrith let out a snort that made smoke plume from his nostrils.
"What use have I for man?"
Val's panic began to settle. She should have trusted the dragon. Her mother did not abide fools, and it seemed Shastrith was no exception. He knew exactly what he was doing. Kalya's confidence seemed to be shaken. Her grin dropped entirely from her face. "Vengeance upon your foes," she said, beginning to sound desperate.
"Death has embraced them long ago,"
Shastrith said, his tail lashing again. Despite another negative answer, Kalya's grin returned, her eyes glittering with glee. "Save for one," she said quietly. Shastrith's body went still, as if every muscle in his body had been seized with the same magic Val's had been.
"What do you mean?"
he asked, his words slow and dangerous. "The last phoenix lives on," Kalya said in triumph. The words hung silently in the air, like blades strung from the ceiling. Val didn't breathe. Shastrith didn't move. Kalya smiled.
"So,"
Shastrith finally said in a quiet voice that hissed with bitterness,
"Death has played his favorites."
The roar of fury that tore from Shastrith's chest shook the foundations of the mountain itself. Val's heart jumped into her throat, and her vision went dark in panic. Her ears ached. The spell over Val broke, and she collapsed. She cupped her hands over her ears. "Shastrith, your eggs!" she shouted desperately.
"They do not matter anymore,"
Shastrith bellowed, shrieks of rage and anguish ricocheting through the cave.
"Nothing matters when death refuses to follow the laws. I will have my justice."
Shastrith thrashed in fury. Clenching her jaw, Val threw herself over the eggs, which leapt and trembled in their nest. Rocks and debris clattered against her back, but she didn't move. "Shastrith, calm down," she barked, but the dragon didn't hear her. A boulder fell from the ceiling and smashed the skeletal dragon's skull beneath it. The sound of it shattered Val's heart. Kalya approached the dragon, her eyes wide with excitement as she drew the feather from her belt. She whispered to it in a hissing, guttural language, and both it and her eyes glowed. With a grin that tore at the corners of her mouth, the girl looked up at the enraged dragon. "Will you give me your power to rectify this injustice?"
"I will burn those phoenixes to less than ash."
Fire leapt from his mouth. Kalya grinned and took up her chant again, the feather glowing until it was blinding to look at. Shastrith writhed and howled in pain. Val shut her eyes and curled herself tighter around the eggs as Shastrith's tail flailed in deadly arcs. Her ears rang, and her gut clenched at the realization that she couldn't save her mother's friend. The guilt twisted through her insides, more painful than the rocks battering against her body. "I'm sorry," she whispered, to Shastrith, to her mother, and to the eggs she knew would be crushed as the mountain fell around them. "Never be sorry for trying to do right," a voice said to her, fierce and quiet, but somehow carrying to her through the chaos. Val whipped her head around and saw the bard crouched beside her, tucked out of the way of Shastrith's and Kalya's eyesight. Her skin and eyes had an odd golden glow to them, and she radiated heat. Despite everything happening around her, an odd sort of comfort settled over Val. "What in Sister Earth are you doing here?" The bard didn't answer, but instead looked Val in the eyes with deep intensity. "Do you need help?" "What do you mean, do I need help? I'm about to be crushed by a mountain if the dragon doesn't get me first." "Val," the bard snapped, "trust me, I understand. Just ask me." "That's what you choose to focus on right now?" "Ask." Val gritted her teeth as more of the mountain came undone. "Help me, please," she ground out. The bard smiled grimly, the glow around her brightening, and her dark hair started floating around her face. Val saw flames dancing in the bard's eyes. "We need to get these eggs out of here," Val told her, before the bard could charge off to do who knew what. The bard's eyes widened in wonder when she saw what Val had hidden beneath her. It was then that a sudden quiet fell. Gooseflesh appeared on Val's skin as the deafening silence pressed on her ears. She turned toward where Shastrith and Kalya had been. Shastrith had fallen completely still, the threads tying him to his mate and eggs nowhere to be seen, and Kalya had changed. Her blonde hair had turned a deadened, lackluster white. Her sunburns had turned to smooth, nearly translucent skin. White, archaic markings trailed up her arms, neck, and face, nearly blending in with her skin, unless hit by certain angles in the light, when they would appear to writhe like snakes. Her feather was gone. In its place, she held a long, bone-white blade. One edge was smooth and razor-sharp. The other was as jagged as Shastrith's teeth. Without moving her body, Kalya swiveled her head slowly to look at Val. Shastrith's head moved at the same time, perfect mirrors of each other. When they fixed their gazes on Val, she wanted to crawl out of her skin to get away from them. They had the same deadened silver stare that spoke of 1,000 horrors. And the worst part was that Kalya looked wholly, completely sane. The bard stepped in front of Val, her body wreathed in golden flames. Kalya's eyes widened fractionally. "You..." Her hand tightened around her blade. Her blood, pure, milky white, dripped down its edge. Fire built in Shastrith's throat, hissing as he cracked open his jaw. "What have you done, Kalya?" the bard asked, her magic growing ever larger around her. Kalya sneered. "Kalya died the day her friends and a pathetic bard betrayed her," she hissed. "Zexis, the last of Mother Night's priestesses, is my title." She snapped her fingers, and more fire hissed in Shastrith's mouth, smoke billowing from his jaws as his chest glowed red with flames. "And I believe my new friend has something he wishes to say." The world ground to a halt for Val, her panic and fear slowing everything down and drawing it into focus. In that moment, with the eggs tucked tightly against her body, her magic flared, and she saw the threads of magic swirling around the other woman. Thick, solid strands tied the bard directly to the earth, and one swept away from her heart into the far distance. Zexis's strands were more erratic. One barbed, silvery strand tied her to her new blade. The other was double-stranded, but frayed, like yarn coming undone, and tied her directly to Shastrith, whose core was frighteningly empty, as if his soul had vanished. Zexis had no one else, no other ties, no other loved ones. Val felt the pull of the earth at her feet, the pull of the eggs and the people she had helped in the world at large. There was something solid and beautiful about those ties. She may have lost her mother, but there was still a place for her in this world. A place, it seemed, that Zexis had shunned. Val focused on the tenuous bond between Zexis and Shastrith. She imagined it shattering, breaking into thousands of pieces the same way her mother's had. The thread shuddered. Neither Shastrith nor Zexis seemed to notice. All Val saw was the identical bloodlust in their eyes. They would kill anything in sight. The bard, Val, and the eggs. Val grit her teeth. Her mother hadn't waited for the fight to come to her, and neither would Val. She lurched away from the eggs and ran toward Zexis and Shastrith. The bard cried out for her to stop. Zexis looked on with bored pity, until Val grabbed hold of the thread connecting her to the dragon. Zexis and Shastrith both convulsed, collapsing. Blinding pain wrenched through Val's gut and coursed through her spine into her mind. She grit her teeth against it, even as she felt blood pouring from her nose. Whatever pact Zexus had made, Val would break it. For her mother, her kingdom, and for the dragon himself. The magic seared into Val's skin, but she grabbed it with both hands. The dragon scale bracelet flashed on her wrist. "Stop!" Zexus howled, lunging at Val. The snap rang like thunder through the cavern. Zexus screamed. Shastrith roared. The mountain shook. Golden warmth wrapped around Val before the pain shut off the world around her. There were stars overhead when Val awoke, stars and smoke. She lurched up, expecting to see half the mountain burning from dragonfire. Her body screamed at her, but she brushed that aside as she looked frantically around. But there was no mountainside ablaze, no dragon roars, only the smoking rubble of what had been Shastrith's cave. "Do you know how many people I've had to drag out of falling mountains?" Val whipped around and found the bard perched atop a pile of debris, a pile of the bard's belongings scattered at her feet. The bard had several cuts along her arms and face, but most of the blood had dried. Val couldn't tell if the dark circles beneath the bard's eyes were from soot or exhaustion. More than one? Val hazarded a guess, grimacing at the aches and pains lancing through her whole body. One is too many. But Val hardly heard her. Her hand had brushed against a large, brittle bone protruding from beneath the cave's wreckage. Tears sprang to her eyes. "Where's Shastrith?" she asked hoarsely. "Gone," the bard said, just as quiet and pained. "He flew off, carrying his new mistress on his back." "So I did nothing." Val clenched her teeth and huddled against herself. "Why didn't you stop them?" she accused the bard. The bard shrugged, her mouth pulled tight. "They didn't ask for my help. You did. So I had to protect you before all else." She gestured to the rubble, which Val should have been buried beneath. But instead, the eggs. Oh, Sister Earth, the eggs. Val scoffed to mask her trembling lip. A lot of good I was to rescue. I'm worthless. I couldn't even save one dragon. The tears started then, thick and silent down her cheeks. "You're right," the bard said. "You didn't save one." She drew out a large, bulging sack from behind her, huffing with exertion. She gingerly set it down and loosened the drawstring that kept it closed. "You saved 5. The dragon eggs glittered in the moonlight, nearly too big for the knapsack. But they were all safe, all still alive. Val wept and went to them, drawing the sack close to her. "But how will they survive?" she asked the bard, as if expecting her to have the answers to everything. "They don't have any parents left to take care of them. I've only delayed the inevitable." "Val." The bard put her hand over Val's and looked deeply into her face, as if she could stare into her very soul. "You were a hero today. Dragons are hardy creatures, and so are their eggs. As long as they are kept safe, they will hatch when the time is right." Val snorted, even as her limbs trembled from residual fear and grief. "Not much of a hero when all I'm doing is trying to fix my mistakes." She sighed and leaned forward, bitterness clawing at her throat as she thought of her mother's voice, of the sacrifice she had made that Val had completely undone. "I should have known magic like that was too good to be true." "Unfortunately, all good intentions have unforeseen consequences." There was a hollowness to the bard's voice that carried lifetimes of sorrow. She squeezed Val's hand and tapped the dragon scale bracelet on her wrist. "Your mother knew that too. You carry her mantle well." She gestured to the eggs. More tears spilled down Val's face as she looked at the eggs. As she watched them, Tendrils of magic, soft, tentative threads, trailed from her chest and connected to each egg in turn. Warmth and comfort bloomed inside her. She trailed her thumb over their smooth, jewel-toned shells and absently hummed her mother's lullaby to them, her throat tight with emotion. You have delayed a great evil today by severing that connection between Zexus and Shastrith, the bard said, her face soft but somehow regal. It will take them decades to rebuild it, which gives future generations more time to prepare. She tilted her head. If you could receive any reward for your heroism, what would it be? Val let out a bark of incredulous laughter. I don't suppose you have a place I can stay and protect some dragon eggs, do you? The bard grinned, her eyes flashing gold. I think you'd be surprised what I can do. All you have to do is ask. I hope you enjoyed listening to Shattered Threads Part 2 by A.L. Lorensen, narrated by Karyne Norton. If you want to read more by Ashley, go to allwrites.com to find more of her books. While there, sign up for her newsletter to snag your free ebook copy of Where Demons Rest, which is such a fun story. You can also listen along to it because it was the 4th episode ever featured on Finding Fantasy Reads, and I'll have a link to it in the show notes. I'm pretty sure Ashley was the fastest and most emphatic author to ever reply yes to my email inviting her onto the podcast, to the point that she even offered a blood oath. I did not take her up on the offer, but it's so nice to know authors and listeners alike are enjoying what the podcast has to offer, especially since she was eager to come back again after having an initial positive experience. I love the little community that we're building through the podcast. In fact, one listener requested a way to chat with other listeners about the stories. I hemmed and hawed over this one because any space like that requires time and moderation. One thing I'm considering doing is creating a Discord server in connection with my brother's Discord. That way, he and I can both chime in now and then, but it would mostly be a space for all of you to connect as listeners, and maybe even a space where featured authors will want to chime in to answer any questions. But before I go to the effort of setting something like that up, I want to know if it's something you as listeners would actually want. So I have a 2-question survey set up at findingfantasyreads.com/survey. I simply want to know first if you're even interested in a space like that on Discord, and second, if you're interested and available in assisting with moderation. I don't anticipate needing many moderators at first, so don't feel bad if you say no, but I can't manage the space alone. So if this is something you want, go fill out the survey, and then I will probably get it set up in the next month or so if you guys want it. So be on the lookout for more information. As always, I will have links for all the sites I've mentioned, including the survey, in the show notes. Thank you all for listening, and happy reading.